Hey guys, welcome back from Thanksgiving break. This is probably going to end up being a pretty lengthy video, so I'm probably going to split it into two videos. So when I talk here, don't get confused if what I'm referring to isn't on this video. It'll be on the next one, depending on how long it is when I finish. So we're going to be doing this project over writing of the Constitution, and over Thanksgiving break, you already kind of delved into some questions about the Constitution and what your family and friends kind of already knew about that. Soon after the delegates from the 13 colonies signed the Declaration of Independence, and if you remember that was back in 1776, they began to tackle this task of creating a new national government, because once we got rid of our king, we no longer had a government. Our first attempt is going to be called the Articles of Confederation, and that's what we're going to kind of focus on first. This is going to preserve state sovereignty, but at the cost of a very weak central government that's going to soon demonstrate it does not have the ability to function very effectively. So 55 delegates are going to meet in Philadelphia in 1787 with the aim of revising these articles. Although some come with the idea that revision of these articles is not possible, and they already have some things written down when they get there, namely James Madison. They quickly realize a new constitution is going to be required, and that a central government adequately addresses the issues that plague our country. And we'll talk about what those weaknesses are and how a strong central government could alleviate those issues. So compromises between various interests mark the proceedings, especially on matters of representation in the new legislature and of taxation. Delegates consulted and synthesized information from several historical sources to provide a foundation for this document. And we're going to look at some of those documents that they pull from. What do they get from the Magna Carta? What do they get from the English Bill of Rights? What do they get from Thomas Hobbes and John Locke and those ideas of those Enlightenment thinkers? What's going to result is a three-branch federal government with a two-house legislature and a strong executive, which we know is our president, to enforce the laws and a national court system. After the convention finishes its work, this process of ratification by the state conventions is going to begin. Supporters of the Constitution, called Federalists, are going to manage through persuasion and deal-making to reach the required number of states, which we're going to figure out is 9 of the 13 states, to ratify this new government, this new Constitution. Some conventions agreed that to approve the document only if this new government will add several amendments, and amendments are changes, and give explicit protection to individual rights. And we know in history that those are called the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, also known as the Bill of Rights. And that Bill of Rights specifically gives rights to individuals, to you guys. The Constitution is going to become the supreme law of the land, and the promised amendments, the Bill of Rights, will be added to the Constitution. So let's look at some of these essential questions that we're going to answer throughout this. The first one, why did the colonists seek to develop a weak central government at the close of the Revolutionary War? I think that one's pretty obvious. What problems were inherent in the Articles of Confederation? And we're going to try to cover that one today. What philosophical and political ideas did the framers draw from writing the Constitution? And we're going to hint at that one today. How did the framers use compromise to ensure that the Constitution would reflect different points of view? How did the framers ensure that government power would be shared between national and state governments, as well as among 3 branches of the federal government? And last, how does the Constitution ensure civil liberties? And we'll look at what civil liberties are and what that means exactly. So first, let's look at some foundations. And next year when you get to world history, we'll talk about the governments of Greece and Rome, and how the American government is going to model itself after what we consider this idyllic, this classical age, so to speak, of Greece and Rome. So, although the U.S. Constitution may be a relatively new document, some of its principles stem from forms of government that were developed by these ancient classical civilizations of Greece and Rome. The ancient Greeks, who are going to originate this term, practiced a form of democracy. Although not all residents of Greece could participate, a segment of the population did not qualify as citizens. Some historians estimate that citizens made up only 1/8 of its population. This system developed in Greece did allow for common citizens to have positions of significance in their government. And the Greek philosopher Aristotle was one of the first to classify governments according to the question of who rules. According to his classification scheme, government ruled by one person would generally be a monarchy or a dictatorship. An oligarchy or aristocracy would be a rule by a few, and a democracy would be a rule by the masses. Again, next year we'll look at what all of those exactly mean. The framers of the Constitution also relied on the concept of a republic as developed by the ancient Romans. The Constitution implemented a three-part system of government and also is going to borrow very heavily from the Romans to develop a system of checks and balances, as well as legislative bodies of an assembly and of the Senate. And we'll learn how these three divisions of government work together and how they check and balance each other, and to make sure that not one branch becomes more powerful than the other. Let's talk a little bit about the Magna Carta. This was signed by King John of England in 1215, and one of the earliest precedents for U.S. Constitution can be found in this document. Compelled by the nobles of his kingdom to sign this document, King John of England places himself, as well as future monarchs, kings, queens, under the rule of law. This established that no government official can be above the law, and as such, they all must follow the written law. Prior to this, the king and the queen, the monarch, were exempt from the law. Now, some of them didn't abuse that power, but some do. Obviously, there were reasons why the English were a little bit perturbed with King John, and so the nobles get together and form an alliance, and they force King John to sign this in 1215. This Magna Carta forms the foundation of English common law, which considers basic fundamental legal procedures and traditions as binding precedent. And what that means is that anything that we've done in the past, we can refer back to it and use it as evidence of why we're acting the way that we are currently. So American colonists are going to follow the same rules in establishing colonial legislatures and then a national government. These framers of the U.S. Constitution consider the Constitution to be the supreme law of the land, and it couldn't be overturned by subsequent political administrations, just as the Magna Carta stated that no future monarch could take away the rights given to the nobles. So there's a lot of talk about what the president can and can't do and what they're going to do, but just know that under the Constitution, it is the supreme law of the land. And the Constitution has a process of which it can be changed, and that it can't be overturned by an administration without going through the proper channels. The only way that it could take place was if we had a fundamental change in the type of government that we allow in our country. So perhaps one of the best examples of the influence of the Magna Carta on American government can be found in the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution. The Fifth Amendment says, let's first talk about what the Magna Carta says. It says, no free man shall be taken, imprisoned, or in any other way destroyed except by the lawful judgment of his peers or by the law of the land. To no one will we sell, to none will we deny or delay right or justice. And about 6 centuries later, the Fifth Amendment is going to say, no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And this amendment is extremely important. You cannot be denied due process. That means they can't take you, they can't imprison you, they can't charge you of something without taking you through due process. Due process means that they arrest you and they go through the procedure and they tell you why they're arresting you, and you're arraigned and you're given the charges against you, and that you're not just thrown in jail and never told why and kept there for forever. Believe it or not, before the Magna Carta, things like that would happen. So, this is also going to become important as we move towards the Civil War. When we look at the Dred Scott decision in 1857, it's going to reference back to this Fifth Amendment. So pretty important idea to remember there. All right, let's look at Thomas Hobbes. Here's a cover of the Leviathan. It depicts the government as this unruly monster that we have to keep in check. So published in 1651, about the time of the English Civil War, and a lot of times we talk about how the literature of the time reflects what was going on in the culture. This is a perfect example of that. So Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan attempted to explain the need for the development of governments and states. In his view, early humans lived what he called a state of nature, in which inevitable and conflict is going to make life solitary, poor, brutish, and short, is how he describes life. So without a government to protect you and to orchestrate these things and to keep everything kind of in order, life was nasty, brutish, and short. As a result of this conflict, Hobbes asserted that people created a social contract with the more powerful and elite of society in order to form governments. In these governments, Hobbes notes that they were created with the consent of the governed, and that should sound familiar to you. Citizens are also going to give up certain rights under natural law, i.e. the right that everyone has the right to own property, in order to receive protection under the government. So we give up a little bit of our freedom in order to have the protection of this government that we so enjoy. In return, the government would expect all citizens to obey the law. However, nowhere in the Leviathan does Hobbes note that the government would absolutely be required to protect the rights of the citizens. Important thing to note there. Other philosophers are going to later expand on Hobbes's work in order to provide this protection. Okay, let's look at John Locke. We've talked about him before. He's the role I assumed in our revolutionary project. So another Enlightenment figure who has a large impact on the Constitution is going to be our English philosopher, John Locke. He writes a book called Two Treatises of Government in 1689, also when the English Bill of Rights comes around. It greatly influenced Thomas Jefferson in writing the Declaration of Independence, and Locke expanded on and sometimes wrote in terms conflicting with Hobbes' view on the social contract. So he's also going to write about the social contract. In Locke's view, not only should citizens rely on government for protection from harm, but he's going to assert that all citizens possess certain natural rights. And he calls these life, liberty, and property. Those should be a little familiar to you, except we call them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Locke believes that the social contract ensured that government had a responsibility to protect these natural rights of citizens. And in instances where the government failed to do so, the people had the right to change the government or to abolish or to replace it. So if a government ceases to protect your natural rights, according to John Locke's theories on government, you have the right to get rid of that government. Let's look at this guy, the Baron Montesquieu. So the work of Charles de Secondat, Baron de Montesquieu, and I'm pretty sure I kind of butchered that name there, also had a great influence on the authors of the U.S. Constitution. He was a French aristocrat, which means he was high society. Montesquieu is going to write The Spirit of Laws in 1748, and he's going to outline 3 types of government. Each kept running smoothly according to a specific social principle. And so these 3 types of governments, number 1 is going to be a monarchy. It's always led by a hereditary ruler and driven by a love of honor, okay, rank, prestige, that we love our king, we honor our king, and we put him there. And later, next year, we'll talk about this theory of the divine right of kings, that the king is there because God put him there, and who are we to question that? And then this idea of republics, in which elected officials rule according to the love of virtue, and virtue is goodness, the willingness to put people before private interest. So this idea of how a republic works is that the people that are elected there put what's good for the nation ahead of what they want. And despotisms. And this one is a ruler which relies on the people's fear of his power. If you have a despot ruler, that's most likely a dictatorship, and they rule by a very heavy hand. Although French, Montesquieu is going to admire England's government, and he believes that incorporating its system of separation of powers between the branches of government and dividing this government into branches, each with different functions, made for both effective and efficient government. The framers of the U.S. Constitution are going to borrow very heavily from Montesquieu's ideas in establishing a 3-branch federal government. And we've already kind of looked at this. Benjamin Franklin proposed this in 1754. That was a failure, and we know that, but let's go back and revisit it for just a minute. Benjamin Franklin proposed this early attempt at colonial unity in 1754. After several visits to the Iroquois Confederacy, a union of 5 and later 6 equal sovereign tribes under a representative council located in present-day New York State. In his writings, Franklin is going to frequently promote the Native American Confederacy as a model for the colonies to follow. So Franklin's plan called for the British Parliament to create a general government for the colonies and with a crown-appointed president as well as a grand council. So this would be a legislature in which wealth determined each colony's representation. So the wealthier you were, the more representatives you got in this legislative body. In addition, the Albany Plan allowed for a confederation that would include both colonies and various Native American tribes. And while the colonies never adopted Franklin's plan, it did serve as a model for later schemes of government, including those under the Articles of Confederation and the United States Constitution. This call for unity, okay? And we know that this is what he used to say, we have to join together, we have to unite, and if we don't, we're going to cease to exist. Let's talk a little bit about the Declaration of Independence. We've already spent what I consider a very significant amount of time on this, and so we'll just kind of revisit it pretty quickly. By 1776, the American colonists, who had become very frustrated with British authority in general, and particularly with taxation laws that they found unfair, and we know about taxation without representation, the colonial militia and British regular troops had skirmished at Lexington and Concord in 1775, and both sides had tremendous losses at the Battle of Bunker Hill after Lexington and Concord. So in the summer of 1776, Richard Henry Lee proposed as a delegate to the Continental Congress that the American colonies declare their independence. And the Congress established a committee to write a formal declaration when they're going to select this Virginia delegate, Thomas Jefferson, to write the document. And while Jefferson's landmark Declaration of Independence doesn't establish a formal constitution or a plan for government, it did note that men have fundamental rights. And he refers back that John Locke had discussed these in the Two Treatises of Government, and Jefferson heavily borrows from John Locke on these ideas. Jefferson specifically stated in the Declaration's preamble that all men are created equal, while also asserting that they have certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and he changes one to the pursuit of happiness. And if you know anything about Thomas Jefferson, that probably makes a lot of sense. Later historians and civil rights leaders are going to debate exactly what Jefferson means by all men are created equal. And the document designated government as the protector of these human rights. That if a government ceases to protect those natural rights, you have the right to get rid of it. Later societies are going to want to put forth similar cases for human rights, most notably during the French Revolution and the Seneca Falls Convention, where they write the Declaration of Sentiments. This is initially what kickstarts that women's rights movement and their push for women's suffrage, women's right to vote. But they're going to borrow heavily from Jefferson's language of the Declaration of Independence, and Jefferson borrows heavily from John Locke's ideas on government. So let's look at these questions really quick. What elements of ancient Greek and Roman government are evident in the Constitution? What concepts from enlightened philosophers influence the content of the Constitution? And what American influences does the Constitution include? Why might these sources have been included?